Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, another edition where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. I'm here with my co-host Lena Marvin. Hey, Lena.
Yeah,
And Dave Bernstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
So how you guys doing? Are you beating the heat? It's been really hot here in the New York region.
it's been very cool here. It's been amazing.
Really?
It's not
Okay.
normal for an August.
Okay. We did have a big weather event yesterday, hurricane tornado warnings, actually, which were pretty unusual for New York City. And a lot of trees down, trains canceled, Metro North canceled, New Jersey Transit canceled, above ground subway service canceled, big outages for Con Ed. Uh, but we are survivors here.
Good
And
idea to cancel Metro North now.
what's that, Dave?
Might be a good idea to cancel Metro North for the pandemic.
I
No.
think ridership is way down. I know I drive by the station every now and then, and I don't see hardly any traffic.
We actually got some data, and typically now in internet days, this is data out of China that I've read in Google Translation from Der Spiegel in Germany.
Regarding?
It was frightening data. I think some of it is before everybody was wearing masks. They tracked 2,000 or 3,000 people who had been diagnosed with corona who had taken trains. And they also tracked about 30,000 people who were potential contacts near them. China, of course, when the government agency wants to track something, they have data like we couldn't imagine. Although we'll hear some things next week about how Google has that kind of data too. And what they found is there was a significant and measurable risk of getting corona if you sat within 3 rows of somebody who was infected.
Really? Wow.
That was scary. Now, it went up to 3% if you sat next to them for 2 hours. That's both better than you might think and really frightening. And when you were 3 rows away, it was down to 0.25%. But it's not near zero. It may be better today in places where there are fewer infections, but that's not a whole lot of the United States. Did you see what New York State just did today?
I saw that what New York City did in terms of they're now monitoring the people coming into the city via vehicular traffic in terms of folks coming from states that have high rates of infection and requiring quarantining. Is that what you're talking about?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. That's local, though, right? It's New York City, or did the governor have a hand in that, Dave?
I actually don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that they are also checking the bridges that are a little bit north of New York City, but maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to do so much going overland to the north because, in fact, infections are way down here in New York and also in Massachusetts and Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And they're way up in other parts of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And, the old fool doesn't realize that he's waist deep and he's still doing denial.
Are you talking about that idiot in the White House?
Yeah, the United States has been temporarily suspended from the world because of ill health. And we're looking forward to that being cured in about 98 days.
Yeah, let's hope so. How are things relative to the pandemic out where you are, Lena?
Bad. I'm not leaving the house. I have a hard time looking at news, but we just had a bunch of voting, and I heard really good info on people doing a good job of getting out there and voting, sending in ballots in time.
Mm-hmm.
My dad and I voted with mail-in, but instead of having it mailed in, my husband dropped it off because they didn't accept his signature as him.
Mm-hmm.
But the elections seem to go well at the local level, and people were able to vote. So we're hopeful that that will keep being the case come November.
Yeah, I did hear that a youngish Black female defeated a 10-term U.S. congressman from your neck of the woods. And it turns out she's the sister of Jamal Bowman, who just defeated Elliot Engel in the primary here, another very long term, I think 13-term U.S. congressman. So I think things are changing. Yeah, good sign. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what you guys think about the reopening of schools. I know it's a huge issue. I know, Lena, you talked a little bit a week or two ago about what's happening at your university where you are. And, you know, I've read that Chicago is on the verge of making an announcement, I think today, expected to announce that they're going all remote learning for the entire semester in Chicago. I think here in New York, they're looking at a hybrid model, you know, some in-person classes, some remote.
But all the football teams in the big colleges are coming back.
Yeah, but aren't some of them having issues as well in terms of infections?
Definitely having issues.
I just saw Rutgers University football team, or one of the teams that, yeah, football, I think had like 26 infections. I just saw in the headlines last night.
All of which is predictable and inevitable, but they're trying to ignore it because there's so much money involved, especially in football. But an interesting observation, schools are reopening in the reverse order. It's probably fairly safe for young kids, and they lose much more if they're losing a year of school, which is what we're talking about.
I totally disagree.
Compared to college students, that's the point I'm making.
No, yeah, no, I actually just agree. I don't think any students should be going physically back into classes. I think the idea that younger students are more resilient is total BS. Kids give each other diseases all the time. They make each other sick. That's being a parent means you have a kid that goes to school, gets sick, and brings it back home. Usually it's just the sniffles, but in this case, it's COVID, and I think it's wrong. I don't think people should be going back to school. I don't think the people who are going back to school are the poor because they can't afford not to. A lot of rich parents aren't sending their kids back to school. They are forming little pods of learning where they have a teacher that will teach a small group, maybe on Zoom. I'm really proud of the districts where there was this public outcry. Well, if you don't want to teach during a pandemic, then don't. And they had enough people quit that the districts had to go online. But I do not agree with the idea that it is safer or more important for younger students to go to school. My favorite kind of students are the ones that have parents and grandparents who are alive, who themselves are not catching something that can be really awful for kids as well. But I realize that I am not a doctor, so I can't say that with as much force as I'd like to. But I am not actually a huge advocate for schools in their current form. I find it odd that they're generally separated by ages, that they don't have enough funding, that they don't have enough teachers. I think now is probably a great time to having smaller class sizes if they are going back to school, so they can physically be separated from each other. But the idea that kids aren't just going to run around like licking each other's faces, going, now you have COVID, seems highly unlikely. But I have been disproven in the past. Maybe the seriousness of this, I have heard this great push that the push for seatbelts came in part from children nagging their parents. And I have heard this great idea of weaponizing insistent children to get everyone to wear masks, and just having kids be the group that tells other people to wear masks. I don't know how likely it is.
Well, you know, Lena, I will give you an amen. As a parent, I can remember when my kids, who are now grown, when they were young, I'm talking about elementary school age, every winter they brought home all kinds of sickness. I got strep throat, I think 3 times, from the kids. Plenty of colds, plenty of flu. I mean, every single winter season, both myself and my wife would get sick, and it was the kids bringing the stuff home. So I mean, they're carriers. Maybe they may be more resilient. That I don't even think there's real good data to prove that, but maybe they are. But we do know that they are great carriers, and the little kids, they have caretakers, whether it be parents, grandparents, older folks of one sort or another, that they're going to come home to and potentially infect. So I think I agree with you on that not being a great idea.
One of the analyses I've heard of, I've heard about Italy, is that part of why Italy got hit so hard is when the kids were sent home, they went to their grandparents.
Mm-hmm. And let me apologize for speaking carelessly. Yes, I happen to agree with you thinking all of the schools should be closed. Although parts of Europe have surprisingly good data, Israel has terrible data. It looks confused. I would make a totally different point, and I spoke badly and wrong. Not that we should open second grade, because I think, Lena, I think you're right about that. But that it's even more ridiculous to opening universities where older kids or young adults are far more able to learn remotely than the average 8-year-old. But the universities are really scared about losing all the tuition and going broke. That there's so much money
There's
involved.
Definitely schools that have already started to go under. I also find it the weirdest closings I've found during this pandemic are rural hospitals, which were staying afloat through optional surgeries. So it is very odd to look at what has shut down during this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. What's the experience with your university, Alina? How are they handling the reopening?
They talk a very good talk. They're being very careful. They've really prepped the professors with the idea that if you can be online, do be online. Mm-hmm. And hybrid models are being pushed, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes. We have had from the library's point of view, we had one professor who said they had to have their students come into the library and have an instruction session. The library doesn't have the facilities for making sure if a class came in all at once that they kept distant enough. So we can't actually facilitate that. We can do Zoom, and that's what we responded with. So there are the occasional professors who don't get it, but I think if I had to lay odds, I think we're going to end up closing again. Mm-hmm. I don't think everyone in the administration wants to, but I think once we have some cases, we will.
Yeah. Well, I just want to remind our audience that we're listening. We're broadcasting here live on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. I'm wondering, Dave, you brought up the question of revenue to some of the universities and colleges. If and when they go with remote learning, won't they still be collecting the same tuition from students, or are they going to get pushback from parents on that, do you think?
They were already getting a lot of pushback. And if they announce now that they were shutting down, a lot of students would say, I'm not going to pay for these remote lectures. I could go to YouTube and listen to a Stanford or Harvard professor instead of my professor at my school. And they'd be right. And Google has done something very interesting. They now are not going to require college degrees for most jobs in order to give people the flexibility to say, well, I'm not going to finish college because it's too dangerous. And because a whole lot of people who never went to college are very skilled. People dropped out of college have done fairly well, like Bill Gates, for example.
I feel like that's a terrible example because you're just naming somebody who started with money. But I often have that response. I waffle between the very kind notion that college can be an opportunity for stepping up economically from one strata to another, because the Department of Labor Statistics suggests that is the case, that as you get more degrees, you will make more money throughout your life, just statistically. But I do sometimes worry that college is just about gatekeeping that money, that it's not about ability, it's about connections, it's about being able to afford a number of years of going into debt, or being able to afford the hustle and cost of going to college. I do worry that it's actually just gatekeeping. So what you're telling me about Google, that gladdens me.
Well, these aren't easy questions, but it's not at all obvious that people who, for one reason or another, don't spend 4 years in studious classrooms or drunken fraternity parties, obviously college students have been known to do both, are going to be more capable of being a good Google employee. And in fact, a lot of the people in Silicon Valley are saying you'll get a better education in our kind of stuff, which is engineering and other kinds of things, by taking a job and learning practical stuff than you would in the university. Now, I think that's damn wrong in engineering and computer science, because what you learn is useful. But the opinions are there. Well, let's get back from the pandemic general things, because we're supposed to be the technology show. Stu, you had some observations of what the pandemic was doing to the internet.
Yeah, I looked at a recent study that looked at over 100 countries and quite a few data points. And there was over a 6% global drop in the speed of traffic on the internet. And I guess maybe 6% may not sound like a really huge number, but the context is that the annual increase had been in the neighborhood of 20%. So when you factor that in, you're looking at maybe a 25% reduction of where we thought we would be at this point in time. What do you think, Dave?
I absolutely and totally disagree. I think the internet has managed to hold up extremely well despite the pandemic, and very few people anywhere have been affected in anything that matters.
Well, the same study, Dave, said 51% reduction in speed in China. What about that? 51%. That's big.
Look at it, and I did. It was almost meaningless because the sample size was 1/25th of the size of their sample in Russia, a country that's 1/6 the size of China. And it didn't add up. China has 400 million lines of fiber to the home. And the numbers that they came up with for Chinese speeds just didn't correspond. So that one happens to be bad data. And overall, there's a small bias in the MLab data they're using. Well, let me translate this 6% drop into numbers. First of all, the United States and Germany actually went up after the pandemic. So did Vietnam, Thailand, and Brazil. There was a drop, and there's some of the countries that they said had the most severe drops they took a look at. Does it really matter to somebody in Canada that their internet has gone from 56 megabits to 50 megabits? Does that change what they can do? Or 27 to 24 in Italy? Or 16 to 14 in Saudi Arabia? Is that a plummet? Is that really bothering people? Is that a big issue? I think we have a much bigger issue on the people who can't connect because they don't have a connection. Starting right here in New York, and that's something that you personally are working on.
Yeah.
So that
I would certainly agree with that. There's so many more folks that have no connection than there are folks that maybe have a slightly slower connection. And of course, as we've talked ad infinitum on this show, that is so important. And this pandemic has just underscored how critical it is to have internet access at home, and not just on your phone or on your smart device, but on all your devices in your home, and your tablets and your computers, and all the residents in the home. When you have the kids that are home and that are now doing remote learning, and maybe multiple kids doing remote learning and in the same household. And then you have parents that may be in the household as well that are doing remote work for their jobs, whatever their jobs may be. And so now you have a really increased usage per household. Now that would be an interesting statistic I like to take a look at, Dave. I don't know if anybody has done that. The per household usage, how that has increased during the pandemic. But certainly, the folks that don't have it, they are in critical need. And I'm really concerned about what's going to happen with the kids here in New York City. I know that in the spring, when the pandemic hit, that the school board gave out a couple 100,000, so they said, smart devices, I think Chromebooks and tablets that were connected to, I'm not sure the carrier, I think it was T-Mobile, that had offered some short-term connectivity to the kids. The issue is, even if the kids have the device, it's the connectivity. And again, if there are multiple kids in the home and the parents at home, how are they going to connect? So this is a big issue that we're working on to do our best. And the city claims that they're trying to help out, and recently announced some funding that they are going to put out there to help ameliorate this reality for so many poor folks, particularly the poor folks in public housing. 500,000 folks here in New York City, half of which don't have internet at home. So we'll see how serious the city is. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I know that they have made given a lot of lip service to solving this issue, and done little in the way of real solutions. And we've talked before on this show about my particular feeling around so-called affordable access. And I think that's an illusion for this particular population. I think they need free access, and affordable is a real nebulous term when you are living at the poverty line, when you have multiple kids, when you're trying to keep food on the table and pay the rent and doctor bills, and so much that's going on, so much stress now with this pandemic. It's really difficult to even find that extra 10, 15, 20 bucks to pay for the so-called affordable broadband. So, I've been saying, and my partner Doug Frazier and I with the DDP and our Streaming University project, we've been promoting this whole notion of free internet. And, I think it's ever more important in today's context.
Let me give you one practical way to make that happen that many people can do right now. I leave my modem router open so that my neighbors could log in if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
That's deliberate, and there are a lot of programs around the world that find ways to do that. I have on my cable modem far more capacity than I'm using 99% of the time. I've got 100 meg down, and unless I'm doing huge downloads, I'm not using more than 5 of it.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't hurt me to let my neighbors share my bandwidth. And in fact, after doing this for a while, I found out that one of my neighbors upstairs was very happy to be able to log on to Dave's, which is the name of my router. He didn't know that I was the Dave, although we knew each other, because he couldn't really afford it.
Mm-hmm.
So that something that you could do right now is, if you have a connection and you're not terribly worried about security because you don't have a pile of secrets on your machine that anybody would steal, consider leaving your router open so that your neighbors can log on. And it's working for me. Now, everybody's afraid they're going to be terribly hacked if that happens. So you have to make the decision whether your neighbors are likely to terribly hack you. My experience is I haven't had any trouble with that. And I'm really glad to be able to help the kid upstairs who's gone back to school and I know is struggling because he works the night shift in a bar in order to make ends meet. And I suspect it's a bar where he'd rather not be working, but that's what we got to do sometimes. And right now,
checking.
Yeah, Linda, take it.
You should check if your router has a guest mode option, because then you can segregate the data of your network from the network you're sharing. That's what I've been doing, but I also took the precaution of just giving the person who can reach my Wi-Fi the easiest, I just gave them a password to a separate network. I would recommend setting up a secondary network because it's probably hidden in the settings of your router. You also might want to change the password on your router if you are able to, depending on what setup you have. It might be currently set up to admin. That's not great. You can figure all of that stuff out by, and I love that it's this easy. You pick up where your internet comes in, you look at the box, you find the codes and the numbers and the sticker that has all of the information, and then you can Google it and just see. But be careful not to unplug anything when you're looking at the box. But you can find out, do I have guest network abilities? Can I just turn that on as a service? So back a million years ago, when I first moved to New York City, I lived in Brooklyn for 1 year. I lived there in 2004, and my roommate and I set up our Wi-Fi as an open network, and we were snoops. We were absolutely looking at the traffic of the people who were using our Wi-Fi because we could. It was really cool. We did name the Wi-Fi hack. So we figured if people were joining like a hacker Wi-Fi network, they should clue in that we might snoop on their stuff. But free internet is free internet, and people are willing to take the risk. It was very interesting. One of the neatest things I found out is I could set up from my router the ability for all images that anyone connected to our Wi-Fi saw. All of the images were just mirrored. So any text would be backwards. Just for fun, just because they could. It was a very interesting exercise, and part of why I recommend looking into the capabilities of your modem that way, of your router situation, is it lets you get to know a bit about what is possible from your router. I'm reminded of when we were talking to the NYU professor about the IoT inspector and knowing just how much data you are putting out there. And anyone who's on the same network as you, not only being able to see all of that, but being able to see any files that you might be sharing as media files, because that's a default in a lot of Windows situations, sometimes with Mac. So I would recommend, yes, have an open Wi-Fi, but maybe have an open guest Wi-Fi. So it's just your information's a little more segregated. But Dave, if you want to live on the edge, go for it.
Okay, Lynn, I'd like you to just walk our listeners, viewers, through a real simple step as to how to look at their router and maybe to look at the settings. But let me first say, you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Go ahead, Lena.
So if let's say I pick up a router and it's a little black box, it's got 3 antennas on it, and I'm like, okay, I want to know about this router. If I pick it up and look at it, sometimes if it is a router that I am getting from my internet service provider, there might be a sticker on it. And that sticker will have various bits of information. And I can actually Google something, like I can look at the sticker and see oh, it's a Netgear and it might have a model number. So this is also a useful trick if you have an appliance that breaks. Sometimes I walked up to my stove and I was like, stove, you are not working correctly. This back burner is being weird. I look at the back of the stove and I similarly see a little placard that has a model number. I go online, I type in the model number, I type stove and the kind of error I'm getting. In this case, my burner isn't working. I find out, oh, this is common with this kind of stove. When you're doing it with an appliance, it can make a little bit more sense because you're like, okay, other people are using the same thing as me. This is a common commodity. A lot of people have this or a similar kind of stove. I'll find a user's manual on. The same thing is true of home routers. So you look at the box, you see maybe it's a little white print on the black appliance, on the black router box, and you just Google it and you can be like Netgear router guest network. So even though I didn't use anything else, it pops up in Google to set up the guest Wi-Fi. Launch a web browser from a computer or mobile device that is connected to your router network. Go to routerlogin.net. And so look at the website you're getting the instructions from. In this case, if I have a Netgear router and the instructions are coming from netgear.com, it is very likely that this is a totally legit set of instructions. And it's like, log in, go to the thing, use the admin. The password is the one that you specified the first time you logged in. You maybe don't know that password anymore. So maybe everything's moot. Maybe you stop at this point and go, this is too hard. That's valid, but you now know more about your router than you did before. If you do know that password, once you go in, you'll log in and you'll get to this dashboard that might tell you things like how fast your internet is or how many devices are connected to it. And in settings, you can go to guest network and set up a guest network. Now, if you don't want it to have a password, you can just leave the password field blank. And then you hit apply, and you also have to name your guest network. So maybe you could name it something like free for the neighbors. And there would just be this unpassword protected guest Wi-Fi that is segregated from your in-house Wi-Fi. I think it's a worthwhile precaution, but I also think it's a good idea to know what your gear is capable of. One of the things that's happened to a lot of people is they're paying for a modem from their internet service provider when they should have bought one.
Right. Rental every month fee.
Yeah. And so one of the things you can do is if you realize I'm renting this box, this is the model number, you can go on eBay and see if you can buy it for yourself. Now that does change how they'll support you, but they might not know that you're not paying the rental. So if you call them up and you have the same model and you ask for help, they might just be able to help you. Mm-hmm. There is always this kind of give and take of how much time investment do I want to do for my own support. I have a friend who recently got a new phone. She has a contract with, I think it's AT&T, and they said, oh, you have to get rid of this phone. So now is the time to buy a new phone. I am not trapped in such a contract. I pay month to month on no contract, but it does mean I have to pony up the money to buy a whole phone when I'm ready. My husband goes the cheap option. He has like $30 or $40 phones. They're good enough for him. I am a nerd and I want a better phone that I can live my life through this tiny portal. But the extra cost of a contract just feels like a trap to me. So.
Yeah. I have a cable modem here at my home, and I'm able to go into the provider website and go into my account and access my router that way. So that's another way that some folks may be able to access their router, going through their account with their provider and do some of the configuration that you just were talking about, Lena.
One freebie that some people might have and not know. I have AT&T internet, and after AT&T acquired HBO, my internet provider said, "Hey, do you want some free HBO for a year?" And I was like, "Sure." And I was able to opt in through my account there. I'm not actually terribly fond of the fact that I feel like we're just going to have these monopolies of content providers and internet providers. So I didn't pay any attention, just because it makes me sad, to the monopoly hearings that were going on. So Stu, can you fill me in? I don't know anything.
Well, you know, Congress had a series of hearings last week. I think they were called antitrust hearings. They had Google, Facebook, and Apple was there, and I think Twitter. I'm not sure who owns Twitter now, but all of the heavy hitters in social media were there testifying. I believe it was 6 hours of hearing around their, you know, monopoly positions and monopoly practices. And I didn't see any of it. Dave, did you actually see any of the hearings?
I decided to wait and read, but there was a lot there. First of all, it's clear that all the big companies are breaking antitrust law right and left. And there were prima facie cases made that, you know, they should be broken up and charge billions in antitrust fines. That's probably not going to happen because they now have so much power. When you're looking at 4 companies that between them have a market cap of over $5 trillion, it's going to be very, very hard to fight them on anything. Now, this is true around the world. In India, they're just refusing to pay taxes. They just declare we don't make any money in India. All our profits happen in Ireland, even though India is, I believe, the largest user of Facebook at this point. And the examples come right and left. The most dramatic one from the hearing last week is that the idiots at Facebook's were putting things that were clearly criminal in their emails, saying we should buy Instagram in order to make sure they don't become a serious competitor. And they just assume they're above the law. And by and large, they're right. Now, what to do about the power of these giants is not an easy question. And I don't have simple answers. But ultimately, it comes down to there is so much power there that it probably is right for society to do something and not have any corporations that big and with that much power. And the people in the hearing was the antitrust subcommittee, and instead of trying to make headlines and cheap shots, they concentrated on the kinds of things that will stand up in court in an antitrust hearing. It's almost guaranteed that Google is going to be attacked on antitrust. The case is clearly very strong. It will drag on for years. And the experience is not much happens from these things. But there's something wrong in our world with the concentration of power. Now, that's true in a whole lot of ways and places, and we all agree about that. How that should apply to internet giants, I wish I had simple answers, but it can't be ignored. Sorry I talked so long. Oh, you guys.
No, that's good. That I think you probably looked at that particular issue closer than any of us. You know, one of the things that I noted in my limited research is that, you know, they were saying, one, we probably need new legislation, that the current legislation is really not up to speed in terms of all the things and tricks that these tech giants can do. And the other notion was that you're going to need folks on the other side, on the legislative side and on the prosecutorial side, that are as smart as the people inside these tech giants. And right now, you just don't have that. I don't mean native intelligence. I mean tech smart intelligence. That they're going to have to be as good at figuring out the nuances of how these giants work, because it's so easy for them to sidestep and work around potential regulations. And the particular story I read was suggesting that right now we're not paying as taxpayers enough money to legislators and to the folks that they use to go after this problem to find the talent that can compete with the talent inside the tech giant. So that's a big concern, Dave. I'm wondering what you think, just in terms of, I know you're a tech journalist. Are there enough smarts in Congress in terms of their aides and whoever they can consult with to figure out, if they have the will, presuming they have the will, do they have the talent to figure out how to curtail these giants?
Well, I'm kind of biased on it. One of the principals, and this is my old college roommate, who now is in Congress, and we drifted apart decades ago, but he's honest and he's smart and he's capable. And he's got a prima facie case. The case is there. The hard part is, do they let Google off with, something insignificant? This $10 billion fine doesn't mean very much to a company that is $1.5 trillion. Or do they get changes that are really important? We've got the experience of the Microsoft case. Microsoft eventually settled and made some changes.
Mm.
Were these changes enough to really change things? Well, most people think Microsoft is still a giant with too much power, and it's also a $1 trillion company now. Although, interesting article, looked over at some of the things that Microsoft doesn't do anymore that they might have done before, like the way they wiped out the Netscape browser and so on. But the main thing they don't do is they very carefully make sure there's no record of any of the discussions of when they're doing something sensitive. And that's one of the things that's going to happen. Everybody at Facebook is currently being told, don't you dare put anything in email that will embarrass us when it gets told in Congress. But that doesn't change the power. And it goes up and down the line. The power of money, as everybody listening knows. But I saw a real dramatic example with an organization I'm not going to name, but Stu and I knows really well, where in order to encourage donations, corporations who made larger donations got 6 times as many votes as corporations or organizations and nonprofits that couldn't afford to give $100,000 a year. So then we look at, what does that organization do? How is it being influenced by the money? And those are questions you always got to ask. But it was one of the most blatant examples I saw of selling oneself and one's offices for corporate money that I've ever seen. Usually, it happens all the time. Usually the power is there with the lobbyists and the money. This is a Washington group. But they don't make it that explicit. It was right there in the rules. I'm going to cut off now because I have a bad connection, and I'll talk to you next week. Explain to the folks what geofencing is. Because
okay. Before we get to that, I will do that. Go ahead, Lana. You have something you wanted to say?
I want to ask you to clarify one of the points you made earlier, because I thought it was curious. Are you suggesting that senators are not paid enough to be a competitive enough thing to have the smarts to know how to deal with tech?
Well, yeah, that's not my assessment, but okay. This is something that I was reading as one of the reporters that was talking about the antitrust hearings, and the reporter's thinking was that yes, to answer your question, that the senators don't have the tech savvy that the tech guys have to really be able to curtail their bad behavior.
I absolutely agree that the senators don't have the tech money. I do think that the senators are paid enough that they should. But I don't know how much of what senators are paid go towards funding a staff of people, or exactly how the think tanks work in relationship to that, because that's part of what I've always found kind of curious. Because like right now, I think senators are making something like $174,000 a year, which seems like plenty unless you start going into how much support does their office need and how much money goes to that. And I don't actually know the breakdown of that. So you kind of, I think of senators as not knowing about tech from an ageist place. I just go, they're too old to know. Which is
What's
some
that,
of the
Dave?
smartest tech people I know are older than you are. And in fact, many of the smartest tech people are the ones with experience, and including, well, whichever. But the money shows up in lots of different ways. I don't think it has much to do with the salary of congressmen or senators, because those people were in that job because they really want it. And there's almost all of them could walk into a $2 million a year job lobbying and choose not to until they get pushed out of office. And that's true, for example, of FCC commissioners also. The going rate for Mike O'Reilly is being fired by Donald Trump at the moment because he was courageous enough to fight Donald Trump on censorship. Amazing story. He's going to have he's going to have 6 offers for $2 million a year from the law firms in Washington to come join them. So he will live well as a best friend. But as I'm in it, they happen to have a staff that probably adds up to $2 or $3 million a year and are paid like them 1/10 what the staff makers can and would make when they move into private practice. The going rate for a senior staffer on the House Commerce Committee and Telecommunications was $1 million about 6 years ago, according to a former staffer who made the decision when he left government not to take the money. He wound up being put as chief lobbyist and probably made something like that ultimately again, but he made the decision. But that's my source on how much money is there.
Well, Dave, the real question is do the legislators have the brain power? We know that they're totally outgunned in terms of the dollars. Do they have the brain power to really rein these guys in?
Yes.
Okay.
Jerry Nadler is as sharp as the $5 million a year lawyers that Facebook is going to put up against him when it comes to antitrust.
Mm-hmm.
I don't happen to know all the other members. Many of them are that good. Not all, and fewer in the Senate. Mm-hmm. But the House committee has some pretty good people. Mm-hmm. And behind them are not just the staff that is doing crucial work. Tim Wu, probably now America's leading antitrust expert, he's at Columbia Law, pointed out that a lot of the stuff that the senators came up with was from a Yale law graduate who had written the article that was really seminal in rethinking antitrust law a few years ago. So there are people like that on that side, but they're outnumbered literally 100 to 1 when it comes down to fighting. That if the FTC takes an antitrust case, as they have in the past, AT&T and Microsoft, they know they're going to go into court with some quite good people. I've met a lot of the antitrust people at Justice over the years. When they're the people who 10 years later are likely to be working for the private sector, making 10 times as much and on the other side of the fight. But many of them are very good. But they're going to be outnumbered 5 and 10 to 1. And in the thing that matters, the Supreme Court watches the election returns. In all the public forums and all the public interests, Facebook has 800 people doing policy advocacy. That affects what you think and what I think and what the New York Times reporter who's writing about the Parabola company. And that's before we talk about the $100 million they spend on outside help. So it's very, very hard to break through this stuff. It's to the point that I almost can't believe how wrong some honest people are getting it, because a $100 million influence budget, which is what all the big companies in Washington have, is enough to confuse almost anyone. I call them the 2 + 2 = 5 gang. The ones that they're paying $5 million a year are the best advocates in the world, or on the market at least. And they're very, very good. Bill Kennard called them the Black Ninjas. And what he said was, he was asked the question, how did this ridiculous policy get through? He was chair of the FCC at the time. And he said, well, they're people, I call them the Black Ninjas. They work at night and they are very, very good.
Doesn't sound very promising, Dave, in terms of the prospect of reform.
We've obviously won some big ones, and it feels really good when they do. Gigi Sohn, when net neutrality came through that she'd been fighting for 20 years, said she broke out in tears because it was so rare to have that kind of victory.
Mm-hmm.
And I've watched how the pros do it. It horrifies me how second-rate amateur stuff is being done by most of the people who I agree with, including some folks that Stu and I know quite well and are working with. And their stuff looks like the 14th man in the office of a second-rate lobbying team. And they're so proud of what they're doing without realizing that they're doing it so badly that they would have been fired by the people I know who are the pros.
Okay, Dave, before you go, and we're just got a couple minutes left on the show, I just wanted to get your and Lena's reaction to the Microsoft again and their offer to buy TikTok, and the fact that the president is intervening. He tried to throw TikTok, threatened to throw TikTok out of the country, claiming that there's some sort of agent for the Chinese government. But apparently he got lobbied by some of his advisors, including Lindsey Graham, that suggested that he might lose a lot of voters. I think TikTok has something like 800 million users, and young people in particular. So now Trump is promoting Microsoft possibly purchasing TikTok. What's your take on that?
Did I come across, is my mic open?
Yeah, we hear you fine.
Oh, so I was saying that, yes, he's got to be really afraid. Every 11-year-old in the United States is going to hate Donald Trump. I don't know about voters, but this is not going to be a popular decision. Mm-hmm. And obviously race is in the middle of it. And Lena, I'm so angry about this stuff. Why don't you say something more sensible?
No, I have nothing sensible about TikTok. I don't understand a lot of the stuff about this. This is we're going to be watched by the Chinese and they'll know our state secrets, and having a lot of people respond, no, they're going to know that we don't have great dance moves. They're going to know that we do have great dance moves. They're going to know that we think we're funny, that some of us are funny, but that it's not actually the kind of platform state secrets get shared on.
Yeah, I think it's a ruse. The president, that is, I think, my personal opinion, is he's trying to cover himself, and he's still working his blame game with the virus on China. And he wants to look like he's punishing them by shutting down TikTok in the U.S. And it's really just a ruse, I think. But in the meantime, we have this big shell game going on, and now Microsoft has come in as the white knight to protect America's interests by purchasing TikTok, or at least that's what they have proposed. And they're saying they're going to try and close the deal by mid-September.
Well, part of it is TikTok has 80 million users in the US, and Microsoft has marketing as part of what they're doing as well, is selling ads, and wanting to sell ads to 80 million people makes sense, especially when that's just the number of users in the US, and that's a growing number. It is a popular platform. It has it's able to engage the low attention span, the share of, like, there's a lot of TikTok content that is being kind of harvested and reshared in other venues. So like a lot of TikTok is showing up on Facebook. A lot is probably not quite true. What's weird is I don't understand exactly how TikTok community works, because there seems to be niche groups. The last joking thing I heard about TikTok is that there are TikTok witches who are trying to curse the moon, and a lot of other witches got mad at them. And then I just tuned out, because it is not a venue that is meant for heavy conversation. Although I do have a friend here in St. Louis who is using TikTok to engage with being Black and online, and what that means to her in a way that's very interesting. And she's been cross-sharing her content between TikTok and Facebook, and it's great. But I also don't understand the platform, and I haven't installed it, so I feel like I can't speak to it like I'd like to.
And well, one of the other threads, and we're about out of time, one of the other threads in that story, I believe, is that TikTok is somewhat responsible for the low turnout for Trump's rally in Tulsa. Or maybe not so much for the low turnout, but for Trump's thinking that he was going to have a blockbuster audience. Apparently, there was a big purchase of tickets to his event by folks that were on TikTok, or at least that's what was reported.
There was no cap on the number of tickets sold. So the fact that he had an empty crowd is because no one wanted to go to his thing, not because the tickets had been like scooped up by TikTok. So I do think there was a little spin put on that to suggest that, oh, they were going to have great crowds. Yeah.
Okay, well, next week's show here on Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3, we're going to have New York State Senator Luis Sepulveda, who's going to talk about geofence warrants. And as I understand it, David, you can chime in quickly. Essentially, law enforcement is able to go out and gather information from all kinds of devices and social media platforms about where people are in any given time and space to help with their investigations. Is that accurate, Dave, in terms of what that is?
Imagine somebody has a burglary on 125th Street. Well, no, somebody has a burglary at City College. The cops can go to Google and say, please look up the information for everybody within 500 yards of City College, what the WHCR is. They would have Google trace for them every student, every visitor, every professor, and this is happening constantly. Hundreds of requests are going in like that. And they talk about catching the occasional murderer, and they probably do. But do we really want to be traced that hard, that often, that pervasively? We're going to have somebody in the state Senate who's actually introducing a bill to prevent it next week, and I'm glad we're having him.
Okay. So stay tuned. This is Next Media Technology with Lena Marvin, Dave Burstein, and Stu Reed. You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM. Tune in next week for some more information. Next week, special guest, State Senator Luis Sepulveda, talking about geofence warrants. Thanks for tuning in.